For the year 2020, China has an ambitious vision for its nation. The party wants to double per capita income for all citizens, which means lifting urban disposable incomes 7% every year. It also wants to double GDP from its 2010 figure and expand its middle class to 600 million. But these targets come at a time when China's growth is slowing. Its consumer spending as a share of GDP is down, far below Western levels. And China's social protection spend is only half that of comparable countries. Reforms are inevitable. So what must happen by when to achieve the party goals? China 2020. Vision meets reality. Welcome to the Caixin debate from Davos.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hu Shuli, Editor-in-Chief of Caixin Media. Welcome to Caixin debate from inside World Economic Forum in Davos. The 18th Party Congress has set this very ambitious goal for doubling per capita income for all by 2020 and making China's growth more balanced and sustainable. We will ask whether and if and how it can be achieved over the next hour. Since we are talking about China now, I will speak in Chinese from now on. I hope the handsets beside you can help you to get translation. 我们今天的这个话题呢是叫做中国2020愿望与现实。下面呢，我想把今天的1个小时分成3部分。第一部分呢，我们谈一下这个愿景能不能实现，为什么，以及主要困难在哪儿。第二呢，我们必然引出一个必然的话题，就是改革。所以呢，我想呢，跟在座的嘉宾一起呢，讨论一下改革的优先序，就改革应该怎么排序。最后，我们谈政府的角色。
Order for the reform. Lastly, we are going to talk about the role of the government. We have to talk about the role of the government and also what's the expectations of our guests on the new Chinese administration. And also, I will leave 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A for the audience. Now, let me introduce the 5 distinguished guests, starting from the middle. And first of all, Mr. Li Jingtian, who is the Senior Vice President of Central Party School of Communist Party of China. Sitting to his right is Ma Weihua, President and Chief Executive Officer. And beside him is Mr. Xu Xiaonian, who is a household well-known economist in China. And he is very famous for sharp words. And he's also working as the professor of economics and finance for China European International Business School. And also I'm going to introduce the CEO of Mr. Ken Rogoff, who is a very familiar economist for all of you, because 10 years ago, he's the chief economist of IMF, and he has had a very, famous debate with Joseph Stiglitz, which provides a lot of food for thought in the economic circular. And of course, I need to introduce CEO Richard Lesser, the CEO of First Boston Consulting Group. Now let's talk about whether we could achieve this vision and why. What are the major challenges? So I will invite all the guests to use 1 or 2 sentences, that is yes or no. Do you think whether we could achieve or how? Start with Mr. Xu Xiaonian.
Yes and no.
说中文，我们用中文。
OK， 回答呢是。
So the answer is both yes and no.
是的原因呢是。
The reasons for yes is that we all know all the numbers provided by China. We could get the numbers we want, as always. No problem at all. If we say no, difficult? Okay, that's it. What about Mr. Ma from China Merchants Bank? I think there is no problem of achieving that goal. For the past 30 years, I've encountered even greater difficulties. So by 2020, double the income is 7% annual growth. Mr. Li Jingtian, please. When we are raising this goal, actually we have already done the calculation, but it's not an easy to achieve goal. So Mr. Lesser, please.
Yes, we believe that it's possible, and more interestingly, we believe that if you look at a young Chinese child born in 2010, they will consume 40 times more than their grandparent born in 1960 over their lifetime. It's a remarkable growth.
I agree, yes, but quite difficult to achieve. I don't think it's going to be easy.
Okay.
Okay, all our 5 panelists have contributed their opinions, which are quite similar with very little nuance. So first, I would like to raise the question to President Li Jingtian. Why are you confident in achieving this goal, and what are the challenges in your mind? Why I'm confident? Before we actually concretize this goal, we have invited experts and economists to do the calculations in the coming 8 years. If we could achieve GDP growth rate and per capita income increase rate, just as President Ma pointed out, 7% year-on-year, we could achieve the goal. Why we say it's also a difficult goal to achieve? That is taking into consideration of the international economic environment, which is also a challenge for China. For China itself, it is faced with the pressures and the difficulties of reform and also development, especially how could we drive internal consumption. All this need Chinese Communist Party, Chinese government to really find the solutions. But in general, I'm very confident. How could we find the solutions? How could we ease the pressures? Maybe President Ma Weihua, what's your opinion? I am confident because of the following 2 reasons. Number 1, urbanization. We still have a lot of room for further improvement. Last year is 51.27 something. So if we want to become a developed country, then each year we could grow by 20% in the past 30 years, while it's 1% per year. But for the coming 20 years, we think it's not a problem. However, it could not be easily done because there are many questions to be solved. Chinese urbanization should be more than a number. We need to talk about during the transitional process of rural areas becoming real cities, how could the peasants, how could the rural households really turn themselves into dwellers in the cities, and how to find the right model, how to find solutions to land, how could we connect rural areas with actual industries. There is still a long journey to go. Second is about consumption. Great potential in consumption. Right now, it's only 35%, which is below the world average of 60%. U.S. consumption rate is around 70%, so huge gap. If we want to really have consumption contribute more to the growth, we need to really solve the questions such as disparity, income level, social security system. Then we have to have deeper level of reform. Thank you very much. President Ma, you mentioned about urbanization and drive internal consumption, which are familiar topics with our 2 foreign guests. I would like to invite Mr. Lesser to talk about how to drive internal consumption. And Robert, please contribute on social security system building in China during urbanization, how people could really turn themselves into city dwellers. And maybe Xiaonian could also contribute. Now, Lesser, please.
Sure. The opportunity to continue to urbanize, we believe, can have 200 million people moving into urban centers over the next 8 to 10 years. And that's an enormous opportunity. Consumption is very low, as Dr. Ma said. And in particular, Chinese consumers do not spend at the levels in other countries. The opportunity is really around providing a security, a safety net that will encourage people to be ready to spend more. That is in terms of health, in terms of living situation, in terms of retirement support for themselves and for their families. And we believe if those elements are put in place over time, it will unlock consumer spend, which will provide an underpinning of support to continue to grow the economy at a substantial rate.
Okay, and Professor Rogoff.
Well, I think the challenge is China shifts from being export-driven and getting its dynamism its productivity increase from the export sector to the consumption-driven sector is not an easy challenge. As long as you're driven by exports, you compete in the world markets. If you're not making good products, you lose. As you turn inward, then political considerations everywhere, not just China, everywhere become difficult. It's not an easy transition. You can write the numbers, you can say there are lots of consumers. It's not that easy. And we can certainly talk about financial deregulation, giving consumers more money. There are issues, or there's a potential for urbanization, but there are many issues about how to move so many people to the cities. We're all familiar with the two-class system, but you look at countries like Brazil, India, they had a lot of problems when they urbanized at that speed.
This is also my question. When we talk about urbanization, when we talk about it's a very important growth driver, are we talking about the land urbanization, or we're talking about urbanization of people? Then if it's the latter, the biggest challenge will be the social security system of China, because right now in China, people is having very high expectation for social security, but actually could China really offer that high quality security, and how could we make it equal and sustainable social security? I would like to ask Professor Rogoff, according to your study of other countries, especially developed countries, could you share with us some lessons and experiences?
Well, I mean, the obvious thing to say is people's expectations often start rising very fast once you start giving them something, and once the output, how much you get, becomes more politically determined and less by how much you work in the market, it becomes much less easy to manage. So there are many problems China has in common. There are others, for example, the fact that many parents have only one child to take care of them in their old age and stuff. That creates a lot of issues. I don't say they're unmanageable problems, but it's not easy.
So what about Xiaonian? It's your turn. About the double capital income of China, I think it's a difficult goal to be achieved. Why? Because we'll always talk about the drivers for sustainable growth of Chinese economy. We always think about the demand side, but I don't think demand side is the decisive part, but the supplier side. If we recall the process of Chinese reform, the high-speed economic growth is not because of the fast growth on the demand side, but on the supplier side. So should we increase the supply? No, actually, when we talk about urbanization, we talk about the, how people in the city spend much more than the people in the rural areas, and talking about the infrastructure investment, trillions of dollars being invested, but they are all wrong concepts. The reason that the per capita income double goal is difficult because of the efficiency. The efficiency improvement of the supplier side is the margin is getting smaller and smaller. The resource distribution is just the opposite of the first 20 years of China's reform. In the first 20 years of reform, we are actually transfer the resources from the so-called state-owned sector to the private sector. The resources will actually flow from the low-efficiency sector to the high-efficiency part. So the overall efficiency of economy is being increased. Then the people's income could be increased. So I'm talking about the key is the supplier side. If there is no disposable income of the people, how could they really spend more? If we want to achieve the goal of doubling the per capita income, we have to consider people's income. How could we increase people's income, and what is the source for it? That must be the economy on the production side, on the supply side, have higher efficiency. Of course, the second factor will be the distribution of the income, as President Ma mentioned. When we talk about the distribution of the income in terms of the numbers, in the past few years, the distribution of the income is more beneficial for the governments, for the state-owned companies, but not for the individual. We have statistics showing that the proportion of the income against the GDP is actually getting lower and lower. How could we really, analyze it? Distribution of income, how could we make major adjustment? That's very difficult. Should you touch the cheese of the government tax income? Should you touch the cheese of state-owned companies? If the government and the enterprises account for lion's share of the income, then the individuals could not have a higher income. How could they spend more? What money could they spend? My impression about your comments about efficiency improvement, I believe GDP 7% growth rate, this is a quantitative concept. In the past 30 years, the average is around 10% when we talk about GDP. They really have a lot of technology content. I remember not long ago, the Vice Prime Minister of Singapore talked with me about the 30 years growth rate of China for being 10%, but however, we're only enjoying the bonus provided by the abundant Chinese low-cost labor cost. We're only talking about the quantitative part, so we need to concentrate on the qualitative part. There is another question that is about the absolute amount of the labor supply in China is actually decreasing, and it had already happened in last year in China. Yes, and we always talk about this 2020 vision. Everyone is talking about the major challenges of China. One of it is the labor supply. Maybe President Li, what's your opinion about the challenges of China for the deepening of reform? About the reform challenges? Those that could be easily achieved has already been done in the past years. Now there are some difficult areas that China has not yet touched, which are difficult areas have not yet been done. For example, many actually. In the past 30 years, we have actually encountered some new conflicts. These new conflicts should be remaining to be resolved by our reform. The next step of reform of China, in my opinion, should be focused on the overall planning. There are many issues to be solved by trial, by crossing the river, by filling the stones. That's the Chinese old saying. Of course, there are risks involved that you will sink in the river. So there are still many issues remaining to be solved. Thank you very much. We will. So, Mr. Lesser, anything you want to add?
Yes. It's important to recognize that much of the advantage of Chinese companies to date were built on lower cost. But there's enormous productivity opportunity that can be unleashed, particularly with a focus on innovation, a focus on becoming more globally competitive, and that the underlying demand in China is very strong. We visited consumers in their homes as a part of their research, and we found that there were consumers that were building homes with garages and with electrical outlets for air conditioners who did not yet own cars and did not yet own air conditioners. And that just speaks to the ambition and the sense of opportunity that is in the Chinese consumers. But it is very true that to continue this growth, improving productivity and creating the underlying foundation, not just around cost, but around innovation, new offerings to consumers, stronger service sector will be important elements as well.
Okay.
I would just say that getting productivity increases in the service sector, which is going to become a bigger and bigger part of China's economy, is much harder than getting productivity increases in manufacturing. Every economy has experienced this. If you're going to expand the social safety net, providing services, healthcare, this is very hard. It's not that it can't be done better, but it's not easy. So the kind of growth numbers you get used to thinking about when you're thinking about manufacturing is different when it's services.
Okay, that finished the first session.
The conclusion is that we have hope, but there are great difficulties ahead, and the difficulty can only be overcome through reform. So the second session of this debate will focus on the main tasks. In the first session, we heard about the general views, and now let's focus on a couple of details. Is there an order? Is there what comes first, what comes next? So this is what we want to focus on. The first person to speak is Rich Lesser, please. We've been talking about large companies. Some of these are ranking among the world top. We were worried about getting into the top 500. Now we are not. So some of these large companies are in there, but there aren't too many good companies. So we want to know, how do we get good companies out of China?
First, we shouldn't underestimate what's been created in a very short space of time to build these large companies. But you're right, there are really important challenges ahead to build the next level of capabilities. And just to quickly cite four, investing in R&D and the capabilities to be stronger in innovation, investing in stronger talent, and investing heavily to build leadership capabilities that have the flexibility to adapt to a rapidly changing world, the ability to strengthen the management teams and to have them be more strategic in deciding where to invest and which sectors to pursue and how to pursue them. And then finally, the ability to globalize, to add capabilities through mergers and acquisitions, and to not just acquire companies and bring what the Chinese company already does, but to learn from the companies that are purchased and improve the organization are the elements that underpin the next stage of growth and success. And there are terrific examples. If you look at Mindray, which is in the patient monitoring space, it's one of the world leaders. It acquired Datascope in the US. Together, they built a stronger company than either had. If you look at the successes of Huawei or Lenovo, you see companies that have been able to invest in R&D, put a premium on innovation, and continue to build.
Thank you. You talked about companies. Now, I'm just wondering, apart from companies, what else can Chinese companies do? And what sort of environment we are operating in? Are we getting what we need in order to innovate? Mr. Xiaonian, please. You were talking about reform. I don't think the question is which comes first or next, or how to do it. In fact, we know how. We've been doing this for decades. This is an issue of determination, political will now. We now talk more than do, or practically doing nothing at all. This is all empty talk. How long is this going to last? I think the priority is not the sequence of reform. So what are the tasks we need to undertake then? You say we are talking only, but we are doing something. So what is it that we haven't been doing? What should we do then? Too many. SOE reform, for example. The state sector needs to shrink. In the last few years, the state sector is expanding. This is the opposite of the direction we need to go. We know SOE are low efficiency. When resources move from the highly efficient private sector to the low efficiency state sector, economy declines. So if you talk about reform, the state sector needs to continue to be shrunk. Like the beginning of the reform, we need to be serious about shrinking the state sector, growing the private sector. Talking about the reform in taxation and fiscal policies, the government needs to reduce its proportion of the national income. But in the last 15 years, it continues to go up from in the teens to nearly 30%. So this is again another example of state sector overtaking the private sector, another example of the government doing what the market should be doing. So you're talking about the reform of taxation. I'm sure there are many things you want to talk about. You can talk about it later. Governor Ma, what do you think? What are the key tasks? I'm just looking at what I need to do. I run a company. First, internally, we need to reform. And how to do this in the context of external environment. Internally, of course, our governance structure, our operation, We've been talking about this for many years. Well, no, not yet. Can we guarantee at any time, in any circumstances, whether good times or bad times, we are able to follow the same governance, same principles? So basically, are you talking about being able to maintain steady operation? Indeed, we don't want to change as the external environment change. Also, can all the companies, irrespective of their ownership, be allocating resources fairly? Everybody has a level playing field. In other words, Governor Ma, well, are you state-owned? Our shareholder? No, we are not state-owned. No, we are not. Okay, they are a share-owned company. We are not state or private. We are in between. Okay. Now, this is a shareholding company. So he said companies, irrespective of ownership, need to be competing on a level playing field. He leads the China Merchant Bank. It's got shareholding from the state, but not a state-owned company. Okay, President Li, perhaps you can talk about what tasks we face. There's international concern about the policy in China. Can you talk about it? Well, Xiaonian said that this is an issue of determination. That I agree. After 30 years, do we continue? It really is a question of determination. The 18th Party Congress declared clearly to the world that we wanted to continue and wrote a paragraph into the charter of the Communist Party, making it very clear that the Communist Party of China wanted to continue with reform and opening up to the rest of the world, and that means globalization. This is where we are now. Development of countries in the world cannot be done on its own. The development in China is increasingly linked to the rest of the world and to the development of multinational companies. And therefore, we need to be more open and do more. Thank you, Xiaonian. President Li said that determination is already clear, so why do you raise an issue here then? Well, official documents have always said reform, but the reality is lack of it. So the government's policy credibility is a serious problem. Lack of credibility. I can't just listen to what they say. I need to look at what they do. Mr. Ma said already, companies needed level playing field. They had that right to compete. Of course, not you. I said, this is not the case. Clearly, there's bias towards the state-owned companies. Certain market only sees state-owned companies. That's why we need reform. It is crucial. Economic reform is not enough. We need legal reform, judicial reform. The judicial needs to be independent to protect IPR. Without it, private entrepreneurs are thinking about moving out of China all the time. They want to move their assets out of China. Who wants to stay in China? Indeed, 10 years we've not done anything. This is a cumulated problem. This is debt we owe historically. Too much debt already. If we don't do it, comrades, we haven't got time. Xiaonian talked about debt of reform now. Robert, reform has been declared. There is the eagerness. So what will it take for us to say, in fact, words meet deeds? There are so many things to do.
Well, just to be fair, there have been some important reforms. So just in the last year, financial sector reform, which seemed like it would never happen, has moved along. There's been some interest liberalization. The government plays a huge role in China through keeping the rate savers gets down very low. It's a big tax on savers, and through the lending through state banks. This is a huge footprint of the government that's not measured in the official statistics, and there was movement. There needs to be more movement. I agree very strongly about the property rights issue. It's one thing to adapt from the rest of the world. It's one thing to take other people's technologies. But to become a leader in technology, you have to protect property rights. There have to be a judicial system. There have to be clear property rights. And then I would finally add that I think a very important challenge that I think is going to be need to be tackled sooner rather than later is the dual citizenship two types of citizens in the cities, where we've said half of Chinese residents, a little over half, live in the cities, but maybe a third of them, something like that, don't get full rights that other citizens get in the cities. And how do you continue this urbanization? How do you maintain stability? This is not an easy problem. And again, point to countries like India and Brazil, which had huge problems with this, where cities got overrun and became less successful. They're coming back now. So they're certainly, these are important things that need to be done soon.
Well, Professor Rogoff talked about financial reform. There was a major movement. There was more movement towards a market economy. So this is continuing. Of course, the financial reform in China needs to do a lot more. Now, I would just like to ask about this. Given that the Western financial markets are having difficulties, and in China, the financial market is not internationalized yet. So what is the next step China needs to take in terms of financial reform? Governor Ma and Xiaonian, but please. Governor Ma says, President Li says, the easy bits have all been done. What we are with now are the difficult ones. Interest deregulation is one of them. Even if you look at the United States, after deregulation, hundreds of banks collapsed. And therefore, in China, this becomes a major issue. Because before reform, everybody was making money. After reform, do we still make money? Do we all survive? That is a big question. To resolve this, we need better management of banks. If you want them to be able to survive, when interests are floating, then the interest spread is shrunk, but your profit margin is shrunk too. So you need to be able to survive. I think Chinese banks are making money, although there has been a financial crisis. But we have still made money. But this is not right. If you're not swimming in the sea, you are swimming in the pool, you're not drowning, that's not great ability, is it? You need to go out into the sea, being able to swim there, and if you survive, then you are capable. Therefore, we are just lucky to escape the impact of the crisis, right? It's rather like swimming in the swimming pool. Would you agree, Xiaonian? Financial reform, Professor Rogoff talked about interest deregulation. That was just one step. A technical step too. Financial reform in China needs to reform market entry. Currently, the entry is very tightly controlled by the government. I don't think it's necessary. SMEs are still battling with their finance because small to medium-sized financial institutions have difficulty entering the market. The control is so tight that they can't operate. That control needs to be relaxed urgently. Secondly, if you open the market, there will be competition. But if it's unfair competition for big banks, if you include a merchant bank and another one, these banks have advantage way above the rest of the commercial banks. They can't compete with these top 5, 6. So that's the first thing. We need to relax the market entry control to create a level playing field. And secondly, we need to reduce the shareholding of government in the financial sector. 4 trillion fiscal stimulus went in, but we don't have figures. In fact, a lot of that was monetized. It was just loans from banks. Once that wave of stimulus was over, we are left with a lot of bad loans in banks. We don't yet have figures of those. And that is because, in response to financial crisis, the Chinese government once again used banks as policy tools, failing to recognize the fact that these are independent commercial institutions. They needed to think about risks. They needed to go for profit. The government pressurized the banks to lend. In the future, once we see bad loans, I doubt that large cash injection that we had in the year 2000 will have to be repeated. Professor Rogoff, perhaps you can talk about your experience here in the West, starting in the US, then in the EU. What are the lessons we need to learn in the financial sector? Mr. Ma said already we are not yet operating at the depth of the financial market. What are the lessons can China learn?
Well, it's certainly many examples of bad financial liberalizations that it is not an easy thing to do. And it often comes later in a stage of development when things have gone well and you're looking for other sources of growth. And we can look at Latin America. We can look, of course, most recently at the United States and Europe. But I think China is nowhere near being at risk of having over-liberalized yet. There's really a lot of scope. And I guess people are optimistic that under the new leadership, we'll see significant further movement. It would redistribute money to consumers and provide part of this engine of growth and also channel money more efficiently. During the crisis, it's hard to second guess what China did because China did okay out of the crisis compared to everyone else. But I agree, I don't think you want to try that very often, that it's getting to the end of the road in this very, the big state banks making loans to the big state companies. You're not going to get energy out of that very many times.
Mr. Lesser, yeah.
Just to build on that, if as part of the new leadership agenda, we can both find ways to narrow the spread in interest and provide more direct access to capital, both debt and equity, to Chinese companies, we will both enable more private companies to grow, we will support entrepreneurship, and we will frankly give consumers more security because they'll see more return on their investment, and that will help spur some of the consumption growth that we talked about earlier. So it's a quite important agenda to continue down this path in the years ahead.
Mr. Ma, would you like to add to financial reform? There has been a major change. For example, for small companies, we shunned away from them. But now all banks are working on small companies. It's not a question of answering the call from the government. I think it's driven by their capital needs. For example, if you lend money to large companies, they're not worried about money. They'll bargain for lower rates. But for small companies, they don't bargain as hard. So banks make better money from lending small companies. In other words, we think that lending to small companies is getting better, isn't it? Yes, indeed, there's a major change here. Okay, that session was about the tasks of reform. I think there is much to do. At the end of the day, we need to review the role of the government. So the first session of our debate is the role of the government and how do we redefine their role and our expectation of the new leadership. Let's ask President Lee to start.
So people's good expectations to a better life for the government and actually for the 18th Party's Congress, we are seeing something new. So what about President Lee's opinion? How do you think about the new government leaders? How could they really deepen the reform? What are the things they should do? And what the public expectation that is could be said realistic? It should be said after the 18th Party Congress. Our Central Communist Party is actually having a higher credibility, a better reputation among the people, just as Madame Hu rightly stated. Comrade Xi Jinping, when he was meeting with the media, he put the goal as achieving people's expectation, which has gained good support and trust from the people and from the party members. Talking about Chinese Communist Party and the government goals, it's always in alignment with the previous administration's goals and methodologies. Yes, we do see a lot of new changes happen to the new administration. How could we actually summarize those changes? My opinion is that the new leaders will pay attention to a more rational, more science-based development model. They will pay more attention to the public opinion, to the livelihood of the Chinese people. The new leaders will pay more attention on focus on reform and opening up. By reforming, the new leaders are trying to eliminate the hurdles in front of the development of China. The new leaders, they pay more attention, rule by law. They pay attention to the transformation of the growth pattern of Chinese economy. And you have all seen that the new leaders is more pragmatic in their approach. I believe after the 18th Party Congress, our party, our government will lead the Chinese people to achieve the goal of building a fairly well-off country and fulfill the Chinese dream. Thank President Lee. President Ma, my question for you is that as President Lee mentioned about rule by law, and this fairly well-off society goal, how could it be achieved? And what's your perspective as a banker? I think that's the basic benchmark when we talk about rule by law. That's something fundamental. As President Lee mentioned about reform of the government, I believe if we want to deepen the Chinese reform, the most emerging task is actually how to reform the government business process from government's approval system to a better one. Right now, there are all kinds of things need to be approved by the government. I think this should be reformed. We have already mentioned that the market should play the fundamental role in the economy. That has already been mentioned for a long time, but in the recent few years, this voice is being weakened. Actually, for any financial crisis or economic crisis happened in the world, it's the government who interferes. It's the government who gives out the money. So people think that under, abnormal background, government should have the responsibility. So this is a very easy to be made misunderstanding. In special phase, it seems that the government approval should be further strengthened. Well, government role, this is a worldwide topic. If the government plays a more important role, then the market will play a weaker role. So, Professor Rogoff, what's your opinion about the government role in the market economy? Actually, this is a worldwide issue. We have all seen that governments are getting more and more powerful in the economy. For a transitional country like China, it doesn't see a lot of rationales for the weakening of government's role. So, what's your opinion?
I think what President Ma said is absolutely correct, that the government plays too heavy a hand. And there are institutional reforms that could be made. For example, there's some movement to shift revenues to the provinces and away from the center, so they're less dependent on their power as governments to get money, that they have a more rational source of revenue, might lead to having less government rules and less government regulations. It's certainly true that around the world, governments have grown inexorably bigger because it gets more expensive to provide services, and to find competitive ways to do that's a challenge. It's not a fine line between where is the government and where is the private sector. The government can hand over the US Postal Service, that's private, but everything they charge is set by the government, where they deliver is set by the government. That's extreme, but it's sort of a continuum between what's private, what's the government, and that's a tricky thing where I think, again, in the case of China, it's pretty clear the direction of growth has been towards having the government have a smaller role, not a larger one.
Mr. Lesser, 听谈你的看法。
If we look ahead, there are 3 critical challenges that China will face to sustain this. One is shifting the balance from investing in infrastructure to supporting its citizens and consumer protections and things that will cause consumption to grow. Second, the trade-off between investing and supporting the state-owned enterprises versus creating a level playing field that will support entrepreneurs, small and medium enterprises, large companies to grow and succeed. And third is taking on, in a real way, the sustainability challenge. This urbanization will create challenges in terms of pollution, as we've seen recently, in terms of the infrastructure required to support it. In each case, the plan that was put forward by the 18th Party Congress takes it on and puts forward a path that pushes towards reform and moving in a direction in support of strengthening consumption, supporting a level playing field and the rule of law, dealing with sustainability. But we know there are very tough trade-offs to go from what is on paper to reality, and the challenge in the years ahead is to make that a reality.
就是有一个问题，刚刚大家给政府。
So there is one more question. We have raised so many requirements or the tasks for the government to fulfill. As the presently, you may have heard that there is still one question to be clarified. Okay, the government is the player for reform. The government is actually to be reformed by itself. It's like a surgery, major surgery to be done. So my question for Xiaonian is that how could the government do the surgery to himself by itself? Wow. Actually, this actually happened in the past in our process of reform. In 1978, Mr. Deng Xiaoping led the party to make the decision to actually, for China to embark on the road of reform at that time. You know, that's something China has to do, which is indispensable with Deng Xiaoping's strong leadership. You know, that makes us think about the 10 years Cultural Revolution. You know, it has really pushed China to the verge of collapsing. So at that time, China had to reform. But now life is much better for China. You know, it's difficult for the government to really make the decision to reform. It's difficult for the government to really have the political will to reform. The government then has to understand this round of reform is greatly different from the past reforms of China. It has to have the involvement of the Chinese people, the massive Chinese people. The ruling party has to involve all the Chinese people into the debate of Chinese reform. We can't only depend on the ruling party to actually really make breakthroughs to break the stakeholders' landscape. It has to rely on the public, on the massive Chinese people. If the government really wants to reform, number one, we have to give freedom to the press, to the media. That's the most direct channel for the people's voice to get through. You can't regulate the media. You have to gradually deregulate the media. Only by doing that, I am convinced that this ruling party is really serious about the reform. Otherwise, it's just a lip service. It has been a lip service for many years. You know, even after each party congress, the 16th, the 70s, we were always confident. I have experienced a lot of things. Okay, Xiaonian, please stop talking, do something. Sense of crisis is different from the crisis. We have to have the sense of crisis right now, not the hindsight. So I have to ask, President Li Jingtian, is there any sense of crisis of the government that it has to reform? Of course, yes, there is. The 18th Party Congress has set it very clear that the Chinese Communist Party is persistent in deepening the reform and opening up. Of course, it's based on a very thorough analysis of both internal and external environments. Something has to be done. Just now, Mr. Xiaonian mentioned one thing that I totally agree. That is, we have to involve the people in the process of reform. Talking about the political system of China is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, and the people is the major body. And it's supported by the judicial system. Chinese reform is more about the improvement of the socialism. When we talk about the improvement of socialism, of course, it will need the party to mobilize the people to raise all kinds of advices and opinions, and then transform this public opinions, the advices, into actionable items of reform formalized by law. So, President Li, you also agree that public participation is a very important feature of the next round of Chinese reform and also a very important symbol. We've talked a lot, and we would like to leave the rest of the time to the live audience here. So now it's your turn to question. Because right now, this is a live broadcast program. So we hope those people who like to raise questions, please have 2 queues, one on the right, one on the left, to be more efficient. Please identify yourself before you raise the question and address your question to the person you want to respond to the question.
Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I'd like to ask the other panel members how realistic they think it is that we could see real freedom of expression and the media in China in the next few years.
Whom do you want to ask? Can you point out?
I'd certainly like to ask Mr. Li and Mr. Ma. and if my American colleagues would like to chime in, that's fine.
李校长，他想请你回答这个问题，然后或者是马行长，你或者马行长。
President Li, go ahead.
李校长。
Guarantee the freedom of the media, of the press. This is the common goal of the administrations of all the countries in the world, and this is an issue remaining to be solved. Chinese Communist Party is the ruling party. Of course, there are other parties involved, So we need to minimize our mistakes. We need to be supervised by different parties, including the so-called the supervision from the society, from the people, from the other parties, from inside the company, including the supervision provided by the media. You may have already seen the social media is actually strengthening the supervision of the Chinese officials. This is a very good thing, actually. Anything to add, President Ma? Yes, something to add. My feeling for the recent years is that right now we have new media coming up. The new media, either for the government or for the society, including their supervision of the banking sector, is really getting more and more powerful and stronger. So this makes me a little bit, under pressure. We have to improve our quality of service. We always take media's opinion very seriously, use it to improve ourselves. Sometimes we are wrong, But of course, we need to have smooth communication with the media in order to get their understanding.
Okay.
Just say it's hard to imagine the evolution of, say, the United States, or you could point at many other countries, without the role of the media in fighting corruption. It plays absolutely an essential role, and the fear of the media and how it will fight corruption. I'd also say, speaking coming from a university, having free communication, really free communication among academics is essential. It's hard to have a heavy hand over the internet and still have a very high level of research and be at the top level. I think actually you cannot compete at the top level without a pretty free internet.
Okay, thank you. 还有什么好提问吧？意见都行。
Any other questions?
Yeah. Haiyan Wang from China Indian Institute. A question for Mr. Li. Party school is instrumental in training, developing Chinese leaders. As you see the many generations of students coming into the party school, do you see any differences? Do you see the newer generation of students into the party school more daring in their desire and their ideas in pushing for political reform?
李校长，又是给你的问题。
President Li, a question for you again. Talking about the party school, I would like to introduce the party school to you so that you could have a better understanding of the school. And this is the so-called demystify the party school of China. The Chinese Communist Party school is the training institution or the highest educational institution for the top-level party leaders. At the same time, the party school also serves as a research institute and think tank for philosophies and social sciences. The Chinese Communist Party School was established in 1933, and in this March, it's going to celebrate its 80th birthday. And for the past 80 years, the Chinese Communist Party and the party schools in different provincial and the local levels have trained a lot of qualified leaders. Talking about these leaders and the students, the changes happened from one generation to another. I really have a lot to say. At the beginning of Chinese reform now opening up, at that generation, the students come to the school for what? For basic knowledge, for academic improvement. For example, because for those people, they haven't got the opportunity to receive college education. is 10 years of blanket. And you may have read newspaper, not several years ago, the party school has held a training, dedicated training class for the new leaders, and 80% of them, over 80% of them are actually having postgraduate degrees. So right now they have better education background, talking about the latest generation, and they are more capable of dealing with complicated issues, I have to say, remain to be solved. Yes, academically they are very good, theoretically they are very good, but they need to grasp the actual practical experiences of dealing with complicated issues. The priority of our training to them is to really brief them about, some Chinese Communist Party socialism theories, as well as really to expose them to a more international viewpoint. Any other questions? We still have some minutes left. More questions?
Hi, it's Juliet Samuel from The Times. I wanted to ask about the Chinese financial system and to what degree you think that there is a crisis there that is maybe masked by government support, and how you would get out of that and reform the system.
So your question is to Mr. Ma, right?
Yes, and whoever wants to answer.
Okay. Or Mr. Xu, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
After 30 years of reform and opening up in China, I believe government's regulation of the financial industry is really different from in the past. Of course, finance for any country, there are certain level of regulation. So there is compliance requirements for the financial service institutions. For example, market access, market operation. This is something being done, the common practice of different countries, especially for those banks who actually absorb savings and deposit. And actually, besides that, the banks are free to develop based on their own business strategies. China Merchants Bank are different from the 5 major state-owned companies. We are generally speaking free. For example, in 2008 financial crisis, and actually this crisis is originated from the West, and actually we have learned the lessons. So our regulation actually being strengthened. Talking about financial regulation of China, I think it's getting more and more micro. It's getting more and more into the FSI. I have, talked with a lot of Chinese FSIs. For those first-line business people of Chinese FSIs, they always complain to me. The Chinese government is actually regulating them too much. There are some business issues that have to be approved by the government. If the government really don't believe in the risk control power of the FSIs, of the insurance company, of the banks, of whatever fund, then how could you really entrust them to develop the industry? The government's hands is everywhere. In the Chinese FSIs. Of course, I am not, talking about President Ma's China Merchants Bank. Okay, it's not China Merchants Bank. Okay, so in a lot of times, we always talk about the Chinese CBRC. You have made so detailed level regulation. You should actually establish, Chinese Republic Bank.
Not just that. They require all banks to operate exactly the same way. That's simply not possible, is it? They want one size to fit all. Mr. Professor?
I mean, it's clear that the financial system has a very heavy hand from the government. It's a big part of the government. I mean, you talk about crisis, it's an evolution of the transition to being more market-oriented, to reduce the redistribution that takes place through the financial system. the huge taxation on individuals who can't hold higher return assets in a fast-growing economy, and obviously a lot of directed lending. So the financial system, I think, is one of the two big issues that I hope the new government continues to tackle, the other being the reforms needed in urbanization.
And the regulatory environment goes hand in hand with strengthening the institutions so that there's not a crisis today, but the desire to continue to open up and deregulate and create more opportunities for individuals and companies to access capital goes along with strengthening the companies themselves, the banks themselves.
Okay, I have to stop here. I'm afraid we are out of time, and I want to quickly thank our distinguished panels. Mr. Li, Mr. Ma, Mr. Asher, and Professor Rogoff and Professor Xu. And to our live audience, thank you for your attention and questions. And to our television audience, I hope you enjoy the program. From Caixin debate, from Davos, it's bye for now.